Hi, everyone. Welcome to Unapologetically You. Welcome to this health and wellness-based podcast where we support you and your loved ones and hopefully give you thought-provoking conversations that could look after yourself and the ones you love. So today's podcast includes a special guest where we will talk in depth about mental wellness and what the health system is currently like. And hopefully we can learn from a professional practitioner in ways we can support our own mental wellness. But before we get into that, support us on what we're doing. You can either hit subscribe if you're watching this on YouTube or follow us on Spotify. We'd really appreciate your support and engage with us on YouTube so more people can find content like this. So this is the part where I usually introduce Kelly, but she is called into work. So I'm going to do these question and answer segments when our guest arrives. So let's get straight into it and welcome our beautiful guest, Atlanta Blount. Hi, Atlanta. Thank you so much for joining me. And it's your evening, right? And it's my morning because we're on our podcast day of Tuesday. How are you? How are things?
I'm really good, thank you. Yeah, I'm stoked to be here. I full disclosure, I'm much more of a morning person, so it is 8:30 at night here. So if I struggle to articulate myself, please feel free to kind of let me know. But it is great to connect with you again. I know it's been some time, well, quite a few years since we connected previously. So it's, lovely to be able to chat again and reflect on, I guess, some of the similarities that we have and the journey that life has taken us.
Yeah, so I'm just going to dive straight in and say the reason I actually reached out to Atlanta today, well, not even today, a couple of weeks ago, was she posted on her Facebook story, she posted an image of a helicopter, and it's not as luxurious as you think it might be. She was being taken into a helicopter because she had a severe altitude sickness. And so, first of all, me for the past like at least 2.5, 3 years coming up to, I've been looking at trekking in the Himalayas and the base camp and things like that. So when I heard first she's trekking mountains, and second, holy crap, you've now been taken ill, I literally just reached out to her. But actually, Atlanta, do you want to say how we first met? Do you want to just go for it? Because it was a
Yeah,
long time
sure.
ago.
Yeah, it was such a long time ago. So we met through a mutual friend. How old were we, Tols, do you think? Like, I'm gonna say eight. Were you about 18?
No, no,
Older?
I was like 22, 23, I think.
Okay.
Because it was,
Okay, maybe underestimate a little bit
yeah,
older than me.
yeah.
But
So,
yeah, so we met through a mutual friend.
yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, like I had times of going out together, spending time at our mutual friend's house, and I guess doing all the things that you do in early 20s. But yeah, and then since then, we haven't had much contact for quite a long time.
No, not at all. And this is what I found really funny is I was literally going to say at the beginning of the introduction was, you meet people at the time of your life where you've got enough money to go out, kind of.
Yeah.
And then you don't have any responsibilities. It's like that is the key time that you're not really in education then, but you still have a little bit of money. And if you're lucky enough to get a good job straight away, like the early part of my 20s was probably chaos, but I had a lot of fun.
Absolutely. Mine was also chaos, and I think that's completely okay, right?
Right? It's 20s is about just enjoyment, having to discover yourself in the best way possible. But yeah, we never really kept in touch, but we were Facebook friends, and like with everything, you kind of just say happy birthday once in a while, you kind of
Yeah.
keep on track of one another. And I don't know about you, but I go through phases with posting. I don't post very often. I'm kind of
Mhm.
like, there's so many different social platforms.
Totally. It is hard to keep up. And for me, it's very like mood dependent or what's going on in my life, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now that we've got the introduction, people know who you are, and I want to delve a little bit deeper into your expertise. But before we do, this is a little bit of a light-hearted thing, but in-depth question. Me and Kelly normally go through our question and answer, and this is more about how you're feeling, how you're doing. So, our audience, in order to get to know you a little bit better, what was your biggest win in the past 7 days, would you say?
The biggest win, I would say, so it is Tuesday here. I had to take my time to think about that because it has been a big week so far. I think the biggest win for me would have been on the weekend. I did a stand-up paddleboarding event to raise money for Lifeline, and that was a 10 kilometer paddleboarding challenge. Um, and so I guess the biggest win for me was I severely underestimated how hard it was going to be. I think like because when I've done stand-up paddleboarding, I've always like selected very calm water, beautiful warm day. And so I just had kind of no idea how tough it was going to be. And so I think for me, the win was just like, the determination when it kind of, the end feels so far away. Like I think the 10 kilometers actually took me a longer time than if I was to walk 10 kilometers. Like it took almost 3 hours because it was in the bay. So there was waves and it was windy. And also, I was doing it with a team of people. So there was supposed to be four of us. But the day before the event changed the date just due to the weather conditions. And so unfortunately, my other three friends were unable to do it. And so I did have that, oh, do I do it on my own or not? And I really felt like absolutely I have to do it. I've committed to it. People have donated, people have supported. So I really still just wanted to go and give it a go, even though I felt really a bit out of my depth in doing it. So that was probably the biggest win, just getting through it. When I started and realized how hard it was going to be, I thought, okay, you're in this for the long haul. Just keep going. Don't look at the time. So yeah, that I think was it for me over the last week.
That is a major win. Like when you said I underestimated 10 kilometers, like I probably overestimate. 10 kilometers is a lot, especially if you're starting paddleboarding.
Yes, and I have to confess, I started standing up, paddleboarding for like the first 200 meters. And then as soon as the waves got bigger and the wind got a little bit stronger, I was like on my knees. And then,
Yeah.
a couple of times sitting down with my legs out in front. So
Oh
it
my
wasn't
gosh, yeah.
the whole time, but yeah,
Standing up for 10 kilometers, like you said, it's different than walking. It's
yes. Oh my
especially
goodness.
with the different climate. It's you just
Yeah.
I'm surprised if it wasn't even that hot. If it was hot, that would take it a lot longer, right?
Yeah, and I also too get really bad motion sickness, and this sounds just so ridiculous, but because of the waves and the time I was just like going up and down, I was thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to be sick. Like this is so ridiculous. And I thought I should have taken travel sickness tablets beforehand, but I don't often go out in the bay, especially when it's wavy. So it got me good, but obviously, such an important charity to raise money for, and so worth it. And I guess the challenge of getting through that is nothing compared to what people go through, with their own mental health struggles. So it's a little bit of discomfort for me for a few hours, which is, absolutely nothing in the entire scheme of things.
Yeah, and I always find that when people raise money for charity, it's during your toughest challenges
Hmm.
during that event or when you're doing something of that nature, it always brings you back to your why. And that is a very strong motivator, especially when you're doing something out of your own back, right? And people think, oh, you're doing this for charity, but it really gives you that sense of awareness and clarity of, why am I actually doing this? And you're paying attention and almost paying homage to the people who are going through their own sense of difficulties and challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're so onto something in terms of timing as well. Like I had gone through a breakup, around Christmas time, which was awful. And I might talk a little bit about that later. But I think, obviously in terms of the function of why I do it, I'm a mental health social worker. And so I really think, those kinds of things really fit with my values. And I also like to be able to do things outside of my normal, day-to-day job in mental health social work as well to support other areas of the community.
Yeah. That's awesome. Okay, so question number
You?
two, what made you smile? What was the thing that made you smile?
Yeah, I've had a big smile on my face all week. It was very exciting because my brother who lives in San Diego, he actually flew home and surprised all of us. So that has been the most incredible, amazing, time that we've just been able to have with him. And because it was just so unexpected, I have just felt so happy, over the
Oh,
past week. And it was his birthday, so it was, lovely to be able to spend that time with him and have our family all together. It was, I recognize that that's such a privilege to be able to do that. So
yeah.
that, I've just been smiling all week because of that.
Oh, I love that. And it shows a lot about you and your values, right? And a lot of people say, family and friends first, but it's another thing to actually have that proactively as that silver lining throughout your life, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was a huge shock because usually, if he's planning a surprise, he will let me in on the secret, and I'm usually the one that goes and picks him up from the airport and takes him to mum and dad. But he knew like the end to last year was a little bit challenging, so he's like, "Oh, I thought you could do with a bit of a surprise as well." So it was very sweet. So now I'm trying not to think too much about when he'll leave quite soon.
Oh, yeah, make the most of now. Forget about the
Exactly.
future. It hasn't happened yet. Okay. So what I actually do like thinking about is an intention. I feel like when we ask ourselves, what is the intention of doing something during the day, the activity, doing something for charity, that it really solidifies our why, but also it keeps us going, right? And like, and as I said earlier, during those hard challenges, it makes you come back to that soul intention. So, do you have any specific intention that you would like to accomplish in the next week?
The next week. So for me, I think my intention is around being able to learn and grow. And I say that in the context of I'm about to start doing a trauma yoga teacher training, which actually starts this weekend. And so I'm, really excited to learn a lot more, I guess, about how the body holds trauma and nervous system regulation. I've come from a space where there's a lot of emphasis on talk therapy. And so I guess looking at it from this perspective is something that I'm so interested in and so passionate about, and something that I found very helpful for me recently. So my intention is to go into that with an open mind and take from it what I can. And I guess the intention of that longer term is obviously be able to use that in my practice as a mental health social worker, and open up trauma therapy to people who might not necessarily benefit from talk therapy or don't feel comfortable with talk therapy. And so, yeah, I'm really looking forward to that. I'm excited about it.
That's awesome. That is such a great way to add on to your expertise, especially when something you're passionate about, right? You can reach other audiences, especially if verbalization is a limitation in that aspect as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's, and I feel like it's becoming much more, I guess, highlighted in terms of other modes of therapy other than the more traditional kinds of talk therapy. I think
Yeah.
that's more attention at the moment, which
Yeah.
is good.
That's awesome. And so is that side of things more up and coming, or has that existed for a while and it's just something that you're radiating towards?
Yeah, look, I think it's something that absolutely has existed for such a long time. For me, it's definitely something I'm radiating towards now. But yeah, I think it has been around for, such a long time, centuries old, in, different kinds of modes or lenses on it. But looking at the body and understanding the body and being curious about, what is going on physiologically and how that can impact on your mood or pain. I think those kinds of concepts have been around for such a long time. But for
Mm.
me, it's definitely a new kind of area of exploration, I guess, because predominantly my practice has been, yeah, as I mentioned before, in group therapy, individual therapy, which is very much talk based.
Yeah.
Um, and incorporates elements of breathing activities or mindfulness, grounding, all of those kinds of things. But I guess the reason I'm quite drawn to this too is I think it really looks at the body as a whole. And,
Yeah.
what I've found, I guess, in my life is that at times intellectually I can understand something and process it. And I'm very lucky to, um, I guess, have a lot of psychologists and social workers as friends and colleagues. So I feel like I get the space and support to be able to do that. I'm very lucky in that sense. But what I found is sometimes my body just can't catch up, So intellectually I'll understand something, but I'll still feel, that I can't resolve whatever's going on internally. And that manifests in many different ways, I guess, in the body. And so I've been really attuned to that and curious about that and look forward to, I guess, deepening my understanding around that and being able to kind of share what I learn, obviously, with the people that I work with.
Yeah, and I always think that it is about a personal experience. Just recently, well, it was probably like 2 years ago, discovered this book. Somebody had recommended it to me with The Body Keeps Score. And if you
Yes.
look at trauma and our own past experiences, we ourselves are holding trauma in that particular area. So a lot of times people complain about aches and pains and musculature problems. But
Yeah.
for me as a professional, as a practitioner and a coach, I always think, well, what stress are you holding on to? And Kelly and I have actually spoken about this, where she had a client who kept having a hamstring injury in his sport. And the thing about injury is, if that is your professional domain and you're out, out of play, well, yeah, of course you're getting paid, but you could lose your contract with the team.
Yeah.
So that they obviously discovered other doctors who could possibly go through different areas of support. And it wasn't just he needed surgery, he needed help. It was,
Yes.
what was the underlying reason?
Yeah.
And there was such an interesting story on one of the other podcasts that we did, but it was like highlighting that area of, even when I'm working with my athletes and corporate clients online, I'm like, what tension are you holding? Because a lot of people complain about tension in the upper neck and the shoulders. And, we've all gone through it. When things have become a little bit chaotic, we've probably experienced certain areas of our body. But I just
Yeah.
wanted to touch on, Atlanta, about your trauma response and how it
Mhm.
showed up in your body. Could you like describe how, going through the breakup and what was your experience of that?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, yeah, there was, when I look back at it now, hindsight, crystal clear, but there were so many warning signs that I was just ignoring. And I think they had been there prior to the breakup. And I guess that's why, in terms of reflecting about it, and I'll probably talk a little bit more about this a bit later, is in terms of, I think there had been, unprocessed, unresolved trauma in my body that I just hadn't recognized at the time. But in terms of, I guess, what I was experiencing was that I was getting a lot of migraines, so headaches, but really bad migraines, like on a daily basis. So, they talk about chronic pain obviously being a symptom of trauma. I was a really bad jaw clencher. That's something I'm still kind of working on. But at night time when I sleep, I'm constantly clenching. So it's like in your subconscious, you just have so much tension in your body that you can't alleviate and let go of. So that was another thing. I'd also noticed that my immunity was so low, like I just kept getting sick, like cold after cold, sinus infection, gastro. And, I had so many blood tests over the last year to kind of, maybe you're deficient in this, maybe it's this, because my immunity was so low, I just kept getting sick. And I try to live a relatively healthy lifestyle in terms of like nutrition and gym and self-care and all that type of thing. But I kept getting sick. And so my blood tests would really show, that I should be really healthy, which is amazing. But it didn't kind of give me any answers about why I was feeling so awful. Sleep, like insomnia, sleep issues, a huge thing for me as well. That's something that really kind of stood out. And I guess, also, things in terms of, I guess this would be like psychologically, in terms of like how you perceive yourself or how you see the world around you. You know, you might become hyper vigilant to threat or fear of loss. You know, I think there was also such a mistrust, and I think often in relationship breakups, you know, people often talk about, I'm never going to be able to trust anyone again, that type of thing. But I think for me, it was kind of the reverse of that in terms of questioning myself. How can I trust that I will make the right decisions? How can I trust that my gut reactions are the right reactions? So it's this kind of, you know, there's so many changes that obviously occur in the body, emotionally, psychologically, physiologically, and even spiritually for some people when they go through, you know, a situation that they have a trauma response to, and that can manifest in so many different ways, and is obviously unique to the individual and their experiences and other physiological factors and things like that. But those were the, I guess, the main kind of red flags for me.
Yeah.
And I also had things like skin rashes and that type of thing that would just randomly come up on my hands. Um, so I guess it started off with one symptom, and then it was kind of that, you know, build up of multiple symptoms all the time, which in and of itself gets you into this anxious, stressed cycle, you know, so then the symptoms get progressively worse, and, you know, you literally don't know which way to go. And it's, I guess, yeah, you have to kind of be curious and look at it from a different lens when the doctors are telling you, no, you're healthy, everything's fine, but you know that you're feeling so awful.
Yeah.
And the other impact, you know, mood as well was huge shift
And
for me.
so, just a quick recap. Did you feel this whilst you were with your person or after? Or was it kind of just like a whole linear thing? It kind of happened during, before, after?
To be honest, I think some of these symptoms I have absolutely had for years, and I think I can trace those back to some of the experiences I had predominantly in my 30s, though I would say, probably not up until my 30s, but definitely after the breakup, it was kind of like, I mean, it was already, those things were debilitating in a sense, but then it was like floodgates were open, and it was literally this horrible, horrible experience of all of that, you know, enmeshed kind of together. And I think definitely those emotional wounds, like, you know, fear of loss and fear of rejection, they were just amplified and so intense that it was hard to kind of see through that. And I guess what I've reflected on since then in terms of that fear of loss, I think that came from a, you know, earlier in my life, my dad had cancer for about 8 years, and so it was this constant, you know, going for tests and checking, and it had spread and it had spread and it had spread, and multiple treatments, and that was such a prolonged period of time. So I think, you know, I have such a fear of loss and losing people I love. So I guess, you know, I was able to reflect on it. It was about the person that, you know, that we, obviously the relationship ended. So obviously fear of loss of losing someone I love being him, but it was much more than that in terms of it triggered all these, you know, other experiences where I was so fearful of losing people I love, or, you know, other relationship breakups. And then I think of fear of loss also in that kind of like future context. Like, so I lost that future that I thought I was creating with him as well. And that was really horrific for me in terms of what that meant for me, or how I saw myself, how I saw my life. That was really, really confronting. And in terms of the other, like, emotional wound, I guess you could call it, was around that fear of rejection. Again, obviously experiencing rejection from him, but it was so much more than that. Again, you know, that relates to other relationship breakups, but also those times where you might have been, you know, rejected, humiliated at school, or, you know, experiences of bullying, you know, that kind of thing. Or, you know, I used to do a lot of dance when I was younger, experienced huge rejection in my early 20s in terms of that. And so I think it triggers, you know, all of that. And then
Yeah.
on a much broader scale, I think, you know, I know, so I have a very kind of feminist perspective, you know, of the way I see the world, and aware of like the harm that patriarchy causes, you know, to people. And I speak about this in terms of, you know, Australian and westernized culture. And I think, you know, this fear of rejection on a much broader scale for me was this kind of fear of rejection from society because, what patriarchy kind of dictates that a woman should be doing at 37 is very different to my reality. And so that was also very confronting for me. And so even though I have the self-awareness to say, I think it's amazing that, people are single. I don't think people are any less worthy because they're single. Then they're not less worthy because they don't have children. I absolutely believe all of that. But I think because we grow up in this patriarchal society, it's the air you breathe. And so there's this internalized misogyny around that. So even though intellectually, again, I could understand that there is nothing wrong with me, I'm not a failure. And I would never think anyone else is a failure for going through a breakup or being single or choosing to be single, whatever. People do and should do whatever is right for them and not be dictated to by these kind of, antiquated views of what, people should be doing at what age in their lives. But I think I still felt like a failure, so intellectually I could understand that. And it really made me reflect on, even though I have self-awareness of these perspectives and concepts and that I absolutely do not agree with them, I still felt that kind of like a bit of shame around that. And in saying all of that, there was obviously a lot of shame and guilt about having this like huge reaction to a breakup when there is so much horror going on in the world. And, so I was also like caught in this, oh my goodness, this is so self-indulgent, my trauma isn't valid, it's not this. And so I kind of got into this really disempowering narrative that, makes you feel more hopeless and more stuck, I felt awful because I recognized that, I am a very privileged person living in Melbourne, white woman. And so with that, there's a lot less obstacles that I have in my life as opposed to other people. And so there was a lot of shame around having such a reaction about a breakup when people are going through such horrific experiences. And so I think it was that kind of reminder to myself about, self-compassion and that, trauma, energy or, that can occur at a micro level and also at a much broader scale. And, reminding myself too, I think the other thing that kind of played into that was around working as a mental health social worker. I work with people who have, such complex trauma, PTSD, they have experienced such horrific, violence in all kinds of forms in their life, which has led to trauma responses. And so, I felt like I shouldn't have this reaction, that kind of thing. Felt a lot of shame around that. So that was quite embarrassing to admit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing that because actually you've said a lot. It's a lot to unpack, but actually, coming online and saying, this is my experience, this is what I've been through. And I was going through the parallels of, I need to have this. It is empowering for women, but then also I've shattered the illusion of my perception of how I want my future to be. And then in the
Yes.
same dosage, you're actually chastising yourself, you're castrating yourself, saying, wait a second, I shouldn't be able to feel these feelings. And who am I to be feeling these things? Because everything else is going on in this world. So, how did you navigate through all of those like minefields, I would say?
I laugh because, and my laugh reaction was because I'm like, yeah, it felt very chaotic and I felt very scattered, and it was not a linear process by any means. And it's that classic, like, one day be like, yes, I'm understanding what's going on. And then the next day I'd wake up and I'd be, 10 steps back again. And that kind of all over the place, or a sideways step and looking at things from a different perspective. And then where does that sit with me and that type of thing. So it wasn't straightforward, and I think there's things there that I'm still grappling with. But I think for me, I guess one thing that I was very aware of, and that again, when I speak about my privilege, I mean this in the sense that, when I went through this experience where I had this kind of trauma reaction and it, kind of activated a lot of, I guess, trauma wounds that I had from earlier, early stages of my life that I hadn't really processed, resolved, healed. But I guess for me, what was really clear is that I had a very stable and safe base to kind of process that from, whereas I think, not everyone has that. And I was so lucky to be able to have that because that gave me, just the space to be able to kind of question things. And because I was in this kind of survival mode, but I didn't have to do it alone.
Yeah.
I had people I could rely on, and so many people were there for me. That's always the silver lining of these things. You realize how loved you are and how much love there is in the world as well. And so I think, yeah, for me, it was that real awareness of that, I know I'm safe. And so that gave me, yeah, the time and the space to be able to explore things and confront things. And gave me probably the resilience as well to be able to do that. Had so many people to kind of talk things through or bounce things off. So I'm very lucky. And I know that not everyone who goes through, trauma has that safe base at
Yeah.
all. And so that is such a challenging thing when people are trying to kind of resolve, what has been going on for them, but they just don't have that safety and stability because it's near impossible to be able to kind of make headway with any of that work without having that. So I'm very grateful that I did have that safe base
Yeah,
around
and
me.
that's really important to have, I say, but a lot of people, like you said, they don't have the capacity or they don't allow people in that
Yeah,
far. Because a lot of times I feel like friends end up mixing friends as social workers and
yeah,
counselors, and it's like you can talk about what you're going through. And often friends do want to say their own opinion about what they think. But I feel
yeah,
like there has to be this boundary, there has to be this line between your friends and not your social carers.
mhm,
They're not
yeah,
counselors, they're not trained professionals. Don't expect them to have all of the answers. And it's unfair to put that on your friends as
definitely.
well. If there's
Yeah,
something that you need to unpack, and this is what I wanted to ask you actually, is you
mhm.
you went through all these, and I love the way you phrased it. You said you went forward, you went backwards, you went sideways,
All
and
over the
you're
place.
looking at this. Well, no, it was perfect because
Yeah,
I think a lot of times people forget to do that, and a lot of
yeah.
times they're bombarded with distractions. So,
Hmm.
and this it's kind of like a two-part question that I wanted to ask you, because the thing is, I feel like a lot of people don't have the capability to open up to their friends or families and talk about this to that degree.
Yeah,
Some may need that therapy because it's
yeah,
unpacked other boxes of
yeah,
trauma in their past. But
yeah.
also, on the flip side, now you're just talking about how to process things without distraction. So, how do you get to a point where you've gone through all of these experiences in your body, you can recognize, the jaw clenching and this
Mhm.
insomnia and things like that. And you're still trying to unpack the fact that, your whole future might have been derailed. It's now on a different trajectory. You have no idea what's happening, but also you're still trying to live your life. You're still trying to be a professional. I
Yeah.
feel that when one thing happens in your life, it affects all areas of your life. You can't just compartmentalize. But a lot of
Mhm.
people try to do that in trying to cope, I feel. And then what
Yeah.
I'm trying to ask is basically saying that how likely is it? Because I found in my coaching, people end up not understanding how their body feels, not listening to
Yeah.
how their body feels.
Yeah.
And then they'll use these distraction tactics.
Yeah.
And it could be something, I say small, maybe not small to a lot of people. It could be, you know, um, abusing food, exercise,
Yeah. Yeah.
all these things. It could be drugs, and it could um, lead to a worst case scenario than actually understanding what their body is going through because they feel that it's just too much to unpack. So, what I'm basically asking is, you would recognize the processes of things are going to come up and you're trying to, one day you be positive, another day it could be catastrophic. All these
Mhm.
emotions are coming up. But how did you recognize and link in the
Mhm.
trauma responses in a physiological way? And
Yeah.
how did you face them? Because obviously that's a process. It doesn't just happen overnight or in a matter of weeks, right?
Yes. Yes. So I think for me initially, I didn't connect it to like a kind of trauma, kind of experience. And I think I'd often looked for other reasons to kind of blame why I was having those symptoms. Like, for example, I might say, and I do think at some points I've been chronically burnt out. So I'm not saying that I wasn't, but, I might say it's work causing this, or I'm just so exhausted, I'm not sleeping, it's causing this, so I didn't ever really. Again, it was kind of that I was so invalidating to myself in that, I couldn't possibly have any kind of a trauma response to this situation because it feels like such a first world problem to have to deal with this. So I think I was very invalidating to myself for a real, like, number of years. Um, and I think it was when, yeah, I think it was like the breakup was obviously the catalyst for change. And I was like, right, what is going on here? Because I'd explored so many things from, like, a medical perspective. So I'd done like quite a few different things to kind of work out what the, underlying function of, these symptoms were.
Mm.
And I had never really kind of considered it through the lens like of a trauma response. And I guess it's that, I think for me, I'm aware of the like physiological sensations. It was just a function of it that I didn't quite understand for a long time. And so I think I'm, lucky in the sense that because I've been trained as a mental health social worker, I'm very comfortable with talking about how I feel and paying attention, to the clues that my body gives me about how I'm feeling. So I think in that sense, obviously that helps me to kind of, process and get through something like this. And, touching on what you were saying before, how difficult that is for some people. Absolutely. I think these skills around, and I'm jumping off course a little bit here, but around, emotional identification, emotional awareness, having insight and awareness of our bodies, that's not something that we kind of get taught at school, or, and it's really dependent on, the environment you grow up in and how that's modeled to you. And I think, for some people, you mentioned distraction, before as a way of coping. And absolutely, I think, these coping strategies that are unhelpful in terms of, managing a trauma response or something like that, a long time ago, they were probably really functional for someone, and it allowed them to survive by, just coping and getting through. But it's kind of, as we get older, we can recognize that now they're not so helpful for us, if that kind of makes sense. And I think, yeah, it's so dependent on, what we learn as we grow up, our kind of attachment styles and things like that, in terms of how things are modeled to us and how secure or safe that we feel. So, it absolutely isn't an easy process, and it can be, I completely agree with what you said, as how completely overwhelming it is for some people to kind of even consider, to even address or talk about, what they're going through. So yeah, I don't want to, I guess, yeah, minimize the impact of people kind of being able to do this work. And also, some people don't have access to resources or to people to be able to do this work as well. Therapists are quite expensive. We know there's a lot of financial stress and things like that. So not everyone is kind of able to get access to that.
But now that you've said that, you raise a really good point. If they didn't have access to it, and they have, okay, so they've got access to this YouTube, they've got access to this podcast, and they've got access
Yeah.
to you,
Yes.
and they don't have necessarily the funds or the awareness, where do they start? Like, what would you suggest? Where would they start to delve into their emotions and understanding what's going on?
Yeah, I really think the first step is really listening to your body and looking for what clues, signs, messages that your body is giving you. And I think that's the initial starting point. It's very easy to kind of mask how we feel and pretend it's not there, but we know that if we do that, like kind of like suppress emotion, it's just going to blow up in our face and kind of result in these big kind of outbursts, whichever, that will look different for everyone. But I really think the key is really trying to develop some self-awareness and tune into how they feel. And if it's too uncomfortable to do that, or too overwhelming to do that in terms of a kind of, uncomfortable emotional experience, it's helpful to start with like a comfortable emotional experience. So for example, if someone's feeling excited, think about where they feel in the body, or if someone is, feeling a moment of contentment, and even if it's only a very small moment, because I guess if people are going through trauma, the majority of how they're feeling is going to be quite uncomfortable, but just
Yeah.
looking for those moments of joy where it is, is it getting into a hot shower and how does that make you feel? That momentary small pieces or small slices of a more comfortable emotional experience, and then tuning into, okay, how does this make me feel? And then developing some of that awareness. And then, yeah, when emotion isn't overwhelming, when it's an uncomfortable emotion but lesser intensity, that could be a helpful place to kind of start that exploration. Um,
Yeah. And are
and
you
finding,
finding there are certain types of people who are doing this exploration over others? Like, I kind of like, I want to touch on, I don't know about
Mhm.
you, Atlanta, when we were younger, or even if our parents were younger, as you said, we weren't taught these things, but there is more
Right.
information out there. It's almost like, how do we build our own vocabulary of emotions, and what does that mean for us? But then
Yeah.
how has it changed from years ago when, say, emotional wellness was kept hidden? It wasn't really spoke about. And even now, we still have elements of, high suicide rates in young males.
Absolutely.
How are you seeing the changes in the demographics?
Yeah, look, I think, you're absolutely spot on in terms of it. There now is a lot more focus in terms of mental health and well-being, and how to create that, and how to, you know, put some self-care strategies into your team. There's a lot more information around that now, which I think is amazing. And I'm aware that they're starting conversations around these kinds of things, or practicing like mindfulness, or tuning into the different senses, that kind of thing, grounding at schools, which I think is amazing, or even, Kindra and that type of thing. And I think it's really kind of starting to, normalize that we're humans and we have emotional experiences. And I think, as human, that's something that we all have in common, wherever we live on this earth, is that we experience emotion, right? And so it's something that connects all of us. It's something that everyone can really, really relate to. And so I think it is being talked about more. But I guess, yeah, like you mentioned, I had zero awareness of that really, growing up, in terms of, I probably could identify when I was happy, sad, really basic kind of emotions, but I didn't pay too much attention to it. It was kind of like, yeah, it wasn't, a focal point of conversation or discussion growing up, or how to cope with managing breakups, how to cope with, rejection from jobs that you apply for, how to go, none of that is kind of talked about, or how to cope with, as I said before, like relationship breakups, but even like in terms of family dynamics and things like that. There was no discussion around that. So I think it's fantastic that it's becoming more prevalent, but obviously there's still, as much as that consciousness kind of raising, information is out there, we obviously still have so many issues in society which contribute to poor mental health. And you know I think it's not an easy solution or quick fix. I think it's probably quite a complex,
Yeah.
multifaceted um, approach to kind of understanding the underlying functions of it. So I think we're a step in the right direction, but we have just so much more room to go. And I think, I talk to my parents about it in terms of, they would say, yeah, we never learnt about this stuff. And you think of generations of my grandpa being involved in the war and that kind of thing, and never talking about the emotional impact, never having any kind of counseling or support for the trauma response to being involved in those kinds of situations. So I think, absolutely there's shifts, but there's obviously still such a long way to go. And, identifying the underlying reasons behind why we have such poor mental health. And I know that, there's lots that have been talked about in terms of like disconnection and, living within this kind of capitalist society where we all want immediate gratification. And, there's power struggles. And so there's so much. I think life is so complicated, really these days. And there's so much pressure on people to perform in every facet of their life and achieve in every facet of their life. And, people trying to keep up,
But
you
that's
know.
another psychological struggle, isn't it? It's that internal about have you figured out what you want and how to go
Yeah.
about that? Or are you looking at what other people want and you're thinking that that will satisfy you? So again, it's looking at that.
Mm.
What are the crux of it? What will make you happy? What is your definition of happiness? What is your definition of success? And a lot of times, if we're not dissecting it into those
Mhm.
micro doses, because it's
Mhm.
going to become macro. That's the whole point, right? It's going, if we're not understanding it and digesting it in that way, well, then we're going to
Yeah.
keep chasing something that we think is going to be satisfactory, and we're going to end up being disappointed. Because if we're
Agree.
looking for appraisal for or recognition on a certain, I don't know, job, if we're thinking we're going to go for this promotion, I'm going to get recognition from my boss and my peers and my family, and then you don't get that recognition, psychologically, that can be quite harming, but they may not have understood that subconscious need to go about that validation.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think that's right. People aren't understanding the function of that. And so maybe, like that kind of narrative that you just suggested, someone needing that external validation, it's kind of like, well, the function of that is that's a way for them to, feel worthy or something like that. So, I guess from potentially like a therapeutic perspective, it might be like, okay, well, internally, what are they missing that they're kind of overcompensating in terms of this external kind of validation? What part, of themselves are they kind of missing that they can't self-soothe and get that kind of, like validation from themselves, or that gratification from being able to do that without having to have other people say, yes, you're so amazing. So it's kind
Yeah.
of that an insecurity there. Is there a lack of identity there? I mean, obviously so complex, but I completely agree with what you say in terms of, I think values is such a huge thing in terms of people finding meaning in their life and happiness in their life. And sometimes I think it's that classic of, people who have too much just always want more, and it's kind of like we forget, what gives us meaning or purpose in our lives, really. And I think, you know how I can relate to that is that it was so obvious when I spent time over in Nepal doing the mountain trek, because I think, Nepal is such a poor country, and the people I met are the most generous, the happiest, caring, friendly, welcoming, people that I have ever met when I have traveled. And I've been lucky to be able to do a fair bit of travel. And I think, there's something to be said that, they're the people that I met, the Nepali people who I met, were living their values. If they had their family around them, they had food, they had shelter, they were the happiest people in the world. And then, I fly back into Melbourne, and, so many privileged people, including myself, and everyone's grumpy and unhappy, and, in this rat race to do this, and they're not living their values like they could be. And, absolutely, I get caught up in that as well. It's the society we live in. But that to me was such a stark contrast in just in terms of differences of, people who are far less privileged than what we have. And I think privilege is that sense of, we have zero control of where we're born into, right? It's
Hmm.
We have zero control over that. And as I said, yeah, it was, yeah, it gave me such perspective in terms of, wow, I've just met such, the happiest people, because, and that's what it is. They're literally living their values, and every day, right? Like, it's not one day a week that they're choosing to live their values, and the rest is all different. It's like every day is that, and often they don't want for anything else because they feel satisfied, right?
Yeah.
Um, and in
Being
saying that,
grateful for where you are, right?
exactly, exactly. Yeah, appreciative of what they have, and I think, you know, yeah, when I look through my lens in terms of, when people have gone through really horrific experiences, sometimes I just expect them to be so jaded against the world, and then, I'll watch a doco and hear them speak, and they're the most grateful people, even though they have been treated so horrifically and unfairly. And I'm like, what? How can they not be jaded about this world that they've had been treated so cruelly, and often they're just so grateful to have life,
Yeah.
um, and to be where they are.
And
So
and
yeah,
I feel like one of the challenges that we have got, I'm talking about the Western civilization and people who've got privilege, is something challenging has come about. It's maintaining that open heart, like not being guarded, not being armored up as much as we think we need to be, and actually just saying, you when you mentioned about the interconnectedness that brings us all together, emotions give us that interconnectedness, right? We are all interconnected, and
yes,
just finding that commonality rather than going, well, this is what separates us. Like, find something that you have in common. You've got probably got more in common with other humans than you
yes,
realize, right? And a lot of people have been taught that hierarchy of, success, power, money, and all of these things have to come because it's only for one person or it's only for a select people. And then that we kind of, as you said, we get caught up in that cycle. But if we're able to be privileged and keep an open heart despite those difficulties, I feel like we are just better versions of ourselves. And I think that we're all just winging it anyway. We're all just trying to do the best we can with what we've got.
yes, absolutely. I so agree with that. I think people do the best they can with their skills that they have at that time, often,
Yeah.
I absolutely believe that.
Yeah. And I wanted to actually ask you, there was one question that came to mind. Do you have like three faux pas, like people who have come across? I know you're in this industry, so you've got a lot of experts in your vicinity, but have you had people come to you just going, oh, I've heard about this about mental health, or I should do this? It's almost like the trend thing, and you're just like, no, that's the
Don't do
last
it.
thing you should do. Like, what are some of the like three biggest faux pas that you've heard of? Just going, no, that's not true, don't do that.
I think, look, I was going to say, like, I feel like people are pretty clued up these days. I guess there's a lot of, and not necessarily from colleagues or people in the field or that type of thing, but I think there can be a lot of misconceptions sometimes, or myths, I guess, around mental health, about what people should or shouldn't do. Or I think too, there's a lot of, it's great, as we were saying before, there's a lot more discussion on social media or other platforms around mental health, but also, I think, for, I guess, lack of a better term, like psychological jargon, can be used. And so sometimes I think people can gravitate onto those kinds of words or labels and then use them in contexts where they're not so relevant. And I think we see people talk about that more so now, in the form of, oh, this is my boundary, but you can't do this, which is not the kind of what a boundary kind of is. So I think it's great that those conversations are happening, but I guess it's around, I would encourage people to try and source credible sources when they're looking for information around mental health. Like, I think absolutely you can, follow some amazing people on social media platforms who are giving great messaging around mental health and that type of thing. But I guess, sometimes there can be a tendency to use kind of language that would be used in therapy, and then for people to try and apply that when maybe they're not really understanding the context of what that kind of concept is or what that means. And that's where I think these kind of misconceptions can kind of happen.
I agree. And I'll give you an example, actually. I can't tell you where the origin of this came from, but it was on a podcast recently, and somebody said that we're using the term narcissism incorrectly. Like a lot
Yeah.
of times, and we've had this conversation previously because it wasn't a word that I would have used to describe a certain person, because I had an unfortunate experience and I learned a lot by it. But my friend had described this individual as a narcissist. And personally, I'd never come across that term. I didn't even know what that meant until I actually looked it up. So I went on the dictionary, went online. I wanted to understand what this meant. And I feel like there's a lot of terminology, and I'm just touching upon what you just said, is that
Yeah.
terminology is not fully understood in the context. And what ends up happening is then every ex is a narcissist, or every person who is against you is that type. But it's it's like understanding that you can have characteristics of what that is, but they
Yes.
don't necessarily have to be termed that. Is that a good example to kind of give?
That is a great example, and I think a lot of people could absolutely relate to that because that's exactly right. Some people can have traits of narcissism, but it doesn't mean that they have a narcissistic personality disorder. And I think, for people kind of gravitating towards those kind of labels, I guess, you know, if that is true and correct, that there were some narcissistic traits and things like that, it obviously can be helpful to kind of unpack that with a therapist in terms of that experience and how it impacted you and what you've kind of taken away from that, how you move on from that. But in the other sense, I guess that, at the end of the day, it's maybe more helpful to look at just like the behavior of what happened rather than worrying about labeling it or identifying it
Mm,
in a certain way, because you can, identify specific behaviors that had an impact on you, and how that made you feel, or how that's, impacted now on your view of yourself, or how you view the world now, and how you're going to work through that and move forwards with your life. I think, you're still able to kind of do that without always attaching a label to it. And again, yeah, I think it's safest to kind of steer away from those kinds of things, and unless you're, processing it with a mental health professional.
yeah. And just going back to, how you process things, I were talking about reflection. You and I are big on, self-awareness and self-reflection and understanding where we are in that moment of time. It may not happen straight away, even for us. It might take a few days of digestion, and then we'll be like, well, what was that? How did that make me feel, right? Or how do I feel right now if there's this uncomfortable sensation in the body? Where is it located? And I feel like I'm still learning about that even as a performance coach. So it's something that I actually wanted to ask is a lot of times people end up wanting to do physical activity, taking, breath work or meditative experiences. And that in itself, it's possibly, you could probably chalk it down to a distraction, but on the other hand, it's a way for them to process it. It's almost like going out in nature is your mindful meditation rather than sitting down and doing something of that nature. So, what are your go-to strategies that help you enhance your wellness and your mental resilience?
Yeah, look, I think that's a great question. And I think you're so right that it's a skill that we're always practicing. And I think, I was just talking it through before, how I was, judging myself very critically around my experience of, how can I have this trauma response? And so that's, I think, again, it's to be curious without that kind of judgment on yourself is that first step. And I think, yeah, for some people, I mean, I guess your question was about me, what's helpful for me, but grounding to the present moment, I think, is very helpful for me. And it sounds like such a basic thing, but I think, for me, it's very easy to get caught up in a lot of rumination or racing thoughts. So it might be, anxiety about the future, or it could be reflecting on the past. So I think for me, it's an activity that helps ground me to the present. And I think absolutely being out in nature is one of those things. I live close to the city, so I'm overly stimulated in terms of my senses all of the time. And so when I'm able to go out and get fresh air and have a hike or a walk or get out on the paddleboard, or camp, those kinds of things I find very peaceful and grounding, and removing myself out of my current environment. It just feels like a fresh space as
Yeah.
well. And so I think that helps to quieten down those kind of racing thoughts, rumination, which then gives me the space to be able to kind of be curious and, investigate, explore what's going on a little bit further. Because if I try to do that when, I'm scattered and chaotic, you'll get nowhere, and you probably then judge yourself and feel worse that you haven't been able to get any answers, and, it can be hypercritical. So I think definitely out in nature is one thing for me. And another thing is really about sorry, getting back to a sense of like creativity, playfulness, that type of thing. And that's definitely something that I really neglected and lost, in I think early 20s. I kind of steered away from that. And I think, reasons for that. We've talked a lot about trauma today, but like experiences of failure and things like that. So then I kind of connected a sense of creativity to failure. So I avoided for a very long time. So I didn't get back into dancing for years and years. I play piano as well, and so I've been getting back into that. So that kind of creativity is also very grounding for me because I'm in the present moment, but it is also very self-soothing as
Mhm.
well. And so, those are my, I guess, main expressions of creativity, but writing as well. And so the article for the Ramona magazine, but also the book on feelings, that's been a little passion project that I've been working on. So that type of thing as well, I think is really helpful for me. And yeah, a sense of play and fun. I think that it's the value of that is often really minimized. I think as kids we do so great at that, but then we grow up and we get really serious, and we need that sense of fun and enjoyment and spontaneity, in our lives to give us those moments of, yeah, just like pure joy. Um,
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people, adults now, forget
yeah.
the sense of awe. Children have this sense of awe. Even if they've seen it before, they're still in awe. Where
Yes.
did that get lost in adulthood? So me and my friend were talking about the other day, and we were like, isn't this amazing? And like, I'm so astounded by the sky and the stars and the moon. Yeah, I've seen it before. Yeah, I'm still in awe of how minuscule we are in the grand scheme of things. So in that sense as well, like you can be humbled by nature. You can go out in the night, you can stare at the sky and allow
Really.
yourself to be grounded and humbled to say, my life is this long or this short, so make the most out of it. And a lot of times it's not ignoring our stresses, but it's putting it into perspective. Like, what is the microcosm of this all? In the grand scheme of things, will this matter in this many years? And I feel like a lot of times when we're caught up in that hamster wheel, we end up using that as the bigger picture rather than zooming out of ourselves.
Well, I completely agree. And, I completely agree about that concept of being, yeah, really mindful. I think we race through our lives really mindless. We brush our teeth without even thinking about it. We drive somewhere, we don't even think about it. Like we do so many things on automatic. And, what you're talking about is really like noticing your environment and being in awe of how incredible the world is. And I think I really experienced that in the Himalayas because it was incredible. Like I was in absolute awe of these amazing mountains and the views around you, and that I was over the other side of the world doing that. But I completely agree, we do lose that sense of
Yeah.
awe as we
Yeah.
get older, and kids are absolute masters at it.
I know we need to learn from them. Like we don't need to have kids to enjoy that, but that is a thing of a lot of adults have come back into that sense of playfulness when they've got kids. But then you've got the added pressure of, they lengthen your life and they shorten your sleep patterns and
Absolutely.
shorten your life, lengthen,
Yes.
all of these things. So actually,
Yeah.
you mentioned your book, and I really wanted to touch upon that. You said that that was something that you felt creative towards, right? You were getting into your writing, you're feeling that this is an avenue you can go towards. And I love the fact that it's about mental wellness, but for children. So can rather than me botch up and describe it, can you describe, what was the thought pattern behind it and what do you hope to achieve um from releasing the book?
Thank you so much. That's really kind of you. And it was really around, I guess, so working within, forensics and community safety, it's very reactive in the sense that, people get support after they've caused harm, to other people, the community in general. And so I really wanted to do something that, focused on early intervention, a preventative approach rather than, we have so many resources placed at the back end. I wanted to do something front end. And in terms of it being a book, I have loved books, my whole life. I've always loved writing, things as a kid growing up and being able to be creative. So I wanted to, I guess put those two passions kind of together and create a book. But I also was motivated to put it into a book because I thought that hopefully, all children will be able to access it. Like, when I say that, I mean as in at a school library or something like that. So hope, in the hope that it's available to anyone who wants to have a look at it. It doesn't matter, about privilege or those kinds of things. Like, as we mentioned before, therapy can be quite expensive. Not everyone can access that. So I just wanted something that could be available if people wanted to, with little like financial cost and that kind of thing. And it is all around emotional regulation, and it's very safe book to use. It's informed by theory. There's nothing in it that's going to open up any trauma or anything like that. So it's safe for children to read through on their own or with, a caregiver, parent, teacher. And so the way that it's set out, it kind of defines what an emotion is and explores understanding physiological sensations and has some psychoeducation around why emotions are important and what can happen if we don't listen to them and respond to them, and the benefits of being able to respond in a healthy way. But it also has some little activities that people can use for self-regulation and that type of thing. So yeah, that can be used, at home, in a school, in a whole variety of settings. So I was really hoping to, I guess with the book, what was I hoping really to again promote this normalization of talking about feelings, because I think, in terms of who I work with, but not even at work, just in general in society, in terms of my relationships with, varying people that I have in varying different contexts. I think so many people are still very uncomfortable in talking about feelings, and I completely understand that. So there's no judgment from me around that, but just wanting to, I guess, promote some, attitudinal shifts around that, and for emotions to be safe to kind of express and identify, and how you feel is always true for you, because that is your experience. And so making sure that we validate ourselves and listen to ourselves,
Mm.
and, work to understand that, because obviously regulating emotion has huge impacts to all areas of our life, with connections with others, even to be able to focus for kids at school, to be able to regulate. We know that, if in terms of the window of tolerance, in terms of optimal learning capacity, they need to be able to be regulated. If they're hyper aroused, it's unhelpful for learning. If they're under, hypo aroused, unable, really struggle to kind of take on board new information. So we need people in that kind of optimal learning zone. So emotion regulation obviously plays into that. It plays into mental health, and just, a meaningful life, so people don't get stuck in, uncomfortable emotional states. And it's not that we ever want to eliminate, uncomfortable emotional states. It's just that we have to be able to tolerate them and learn ways of coping with them. We're always going to feel a wide range of emotions. We're never just always going to, feel great all the time. And often people will say, oh, well, I'm just not going to get angry anymore. And that's never going to work. We all get angry, right? We all so those uncomfortable emotions will always come up. That's guaranteed throughout our lifespan. We're going to have so many uncomfortable emotions. And so the aim is to really get people to understand themselves, understand those emotions, be able to tolerate them, cope with them, and learn some skills and strategies to be able to kind of process that and move through it. But also for adults too. So I think it sets, hopefully, will, set younger generations up for success in terms of just the awareness, I guess, insight and awareness into
I love
feelings.
that. No,
Thank
I love
you.
that. And we need to have those conversations, right? And I feel like the way you're approaching it is saying that young children should understand this too, because we weren't taught it. And it's a lot of pressure
Yeah.
for parents to teach them everything about money, about emotions, about all of the patriarchy, all about the history. Like, even schools don't give them a full picture. They will only give what that country has gone through. And even then
Yes.
it's selective.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's a lot of pressure for families to try and give those resources to children when they
Yeah.
can actually approach these areas through a lighter way, I want to say, but
Yeah.
also even understanding how they're feeling at that time gives them that sense of empowerment. Like, rather than
Absolutely.
diluting how they feel, it's saying they can now communicate they can communicate with adults to say, well, this is how I feel, rather than it being brushed off like it commonly does.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're so right. It is empowering and instead of people feeling, overwhelmed and helpless with emotion, they can recognize, oh, there's some things I can do that will absolutely help. And maybe it won't shift the entire emotion, but yes, it will lower the intensity. And then,
Yeah.
over time that will lessen and then it will shift, So that's a really good point about empowerment. And in terms of the book as well, I've had an amazing illustrator, Meg Kolak, who I actually went to school with. She was a couple of years below me, so she's an amazing artist here in in Melbourne, and so she's done these amazing illustrations. And so for children who are more visual learners, I'm a very visual person myself. She has really brought the concepts to life because I think emotions can be, well, it is a bit of an abstract concept, and so it can be challenging for children to kind of grasp that because it's not tangible. You can't, really see an
Yeah.
emotion. It's very abstract. And so she has done an amazing job with the illustrations, really brought a lot of things to life to help with understanding. We've used a lot of metaphors and analogies and things like that. So what's in the book, it's not new information, but it's in a palatable format for children because this information has been around, but hopefully it's in a format that is, yeah, understandable and to children and reaches them with where they're at.
I love that. So when the book becomes fully published and, buyable, I'll make sure that we put it in the description box below. So hopefully when this airs, we'll probably see some outcomes for that. But also, Kelly and I, so the last question actually I want to ask you, Atlanta,
Yeah.
is Kelly and I, we always do a health motivational tip of the day to round up our podcast. So,
Okay.
what would be your health motivational tip of the day? And what it could be something that you've already spoke about, or it could be something that you're doing personally. So, what would be your health motivational tip of the day?
Okay. I guess, okay. One thing I think that is so important, and again, something that I'm still practicing, is around self-compassion. And so, curiously exploring what's going on without judgment. And I think it sounds like such a simple thing, but it's incredible how often we can be hypercritical of ourselves and not recognize that we're doing it. And, I've really had to focus on practicing what I'm preaching to other people all the time and seeing, where I'm going wrong. And I think so self-compassion, as we said before, often people are doing the absolute best that they can with the skills that they have at that time, and so having the self-compassion to understand what's going on, but also recognize that you can grow and you can learn. And but in order to be able to do that, you have to not be so hard on yourself all the time.
Agree. Yeah, I think that's a brilliant health motivational tip of the day. So thank you so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for giving us that insight. And anybody who wants to connect with Atlanta, I will link her information in the description box. But thank you everyone for listening in on this podcast. If you found this useful, please comment below, share it with your friends and family. We would love for you to be a part of this community. We are still growing our channel. So don't miss latest alerts, subscribe to the channel, and I hope you've enjoyed this one. We will see you on the next one. Bye,
Thank you.
Atlanta.
See you later. Bye.